The old town of Havenwood clung to its history like barnacles to a ship, and none clung tighter than the Havenwood Historical Preservation Society. For decades, they'd been the undisputed arbiters of taste, tradition, and most lucratively, zoning permits. Their current president, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, wielded their bylaws like a battle axe. But our protagonist, Marcus Thorne, was not one for battle axes. He was a forensic cartographer, a man who spent his days dissecting land records, satellite imagery, and ancient survey maps to solve disputes over property lines and historical boundaries. He was quiet, meticulous, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot a discrepancy in a plat map from 50 paces. Marcus had moved to Havenwood a year ago, drawn by its charming, if slightly over-regulated historic homes. He bought a small, unassuming cottage with a sprawling backyard, intending to finally build the elaborate, koi-filled water garden he'd always dreamed of. He diligently submitted his plans to the Havenwood Historical Preservation Society, expecting the usual bureaucratic delays. What he got instead was a categorical rejection. "Your proposed water feature," Eleanor Vance's letter read, dripping with condescension, "exceeds the permissible footprint for ornamental landscaping as defined in Article 7, Section C of our bylaws. Furthermore, the naturalistic rock formations you propose are not in keeping with the early colonial revival aesthetic of your property." Marcus sighed. He'd meticulously designed it to be both beautiful and historically harmonious. He appealed, providing detailed drawings and historical precedents. The appeal was denied. He tried to speak with Eleanor, but she was a fortress of perfectly coiffed hair and unyielding pronouncements. The final straw came a month later when he received a notice of violation. He had planted a small Japanese maple tree near his property line, a subtle, beautiful specimen that would have fit perfectly in any garden. The notice stated it was non-native and intrusive to the established arboreal character of Havenwood. A $200 fine was attached, with an additional $50 per week until it was removed. This wasn't about the tree, Marcus realized. This was about Eleanor Vance's personal disdain for anything she perceived as new or non-conforming. He glanced at the sprawling, meticulously manicured hedges of Eleanor's own property, which bordered his. He knew from casual observation that several of her shrubs were decidedly not early colonial revival, but Eleanor Vance had the society, the bylaws, and the collective fear of the town on her side. Marcus, however, had something more potent, his cartography skills. The 1920 subdivision plat, and the most recent municipal GIS data. The Havenwood Historical Preservation Society's bylaws, specifically Article 7, Section C, defined ornamental landscaping as features lying entirely within the property's original surveyed boundaries. Most people assumed this meant their current property lines, but Marcus, with his forensic eye, knew better. Which followed the stream, had actually expanded over time due to the stream's natural migration. Then came the clincher, the early colonial revival aesthetic. Marcus cross-referenced Eleanor's property plans with historical gardening texts from the colonial period. He found a glaring inconsistency. The sprawling, perfectly symmetrical rose garden that Eleanor Vance so proudly displayed, the one she often showed off during town garden tours, was not early colonial revival. Its layout and specific species of hybrid tea roses were, in fact, Victorian era, a clear violation of her own property's stated historical designation. He also found that a significant portion of Eleanor's prize-winning perennial garden, meticulously documented in her permits as native wildflower meadow, was actually composed of several species of invasive non-native plants introduced in the early 20th century. His satellite imagery, spanning years, clearly showed the garden expanding beyond what the original permits allowed, encroaching on what the 1792 map showed as town common land. Marcus assembled his evidence, meticulously annotated maps, side-by-side comparisons of historical and modern satellite imagery, geological reports, botanical analyses, and copies of Eleanor Vance's own submitted permits. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced to the Society's bylaws. He didn't appeal again. Instead, he requested an emergency meeting of the entire Havenwood Historical Preservation Society Board, citing unforeseen and significant discrepancies pertaining to the interpretation and enforcement of Article 7, Section C, and the foundational historical integrity of member properties. The meeting was tense. Eleanor Vance, radiating indignation, sat at the head of the long oak table. Marcus, calm as a pond, presented his findings. He didn't accuse, he simply presented data. He started with the shifting stream, showing how Eleanor's property, by the Society's own definition of original surveyed boundaries, was actually smaller than she claimed, meaning her ornamental landscaping was effectively spilling onto town land. Then he moved to the rose garden, projecting images of historical plant guides next to Eleanor's carefully documented plans. According to your own bylaws, Madam President, these are a clear anachronism. A beautiful anachronism, perhaps, but an anachronism nonetheless. Finally, he unveiled the invasive species in her native wildflower meadow, and most damningly, the expansion of her gardens beyond the original 1792 property lines, encroaching onto public land. He projected the satellite images, showing the slow, steady creep over years. Silence. The other board members, initially wary, now stared at Eleanor with growing horror. The meticulous, undeniable evidence from Marcus Thorne, the forensic cartographer, had exposed their unassailable leader as the biggest violator of their own sacred rules. Eleanor Vance, for the first time in memory, was speechless. Her face was a mask of furious disbelief. The board, faced with irrefutable proof, had no choice. They dismissed Eleanor Vance from her presidency, stripped her of her own non-conforming landscaping, and, most importantly, immediately rescinded all violations issued to Marcus Thorne. They even offered to compensate him for the time spent resolving the misunderstanding. Marcus politely declined the compensation. He simply wanted to build his water garden. A few months later, the gentle trickle of water could be heard from Marcus's backyard, flowing into a beautifully sculpted pond surrounded by meticulously placed rocks. His Japanese maple, flourishing, stood proudly by the fence line. And every so often, as the sun set over Havenwood, Marcus would glance towards Eleanor Vance's now rather stark and significantly smaller yard and allow himself a small, knowing smile. He had simply used the facts to fight the bully. And in Havenwood, that was a victory more profound than any battle axe could achieve.